Archaeology porn.
You may have missed it in the news, but a major event just occurred at the intersection of the worlds of archaeology and tourism. Now, it's about a decade overdue, but on October 16th, 2024, the Grand Egyptian Museum at Giza finally opened its doors in a soft opening. And let me tell you, it is a gem. But the hottest exhibit of them all has yet to open. Apparently, it's too hot for the general public to handle, and that would be the treasures of the tomb of King Tutankhamun. And to give you a sense of how stunning this stuff is, when King Tut's tomb went on tour in 1978, it caused such a sensation that even SNL felt compelled to respond to the reaction in New York.
Now when he was a young man, he never thought he'd see people stand in line to see the boy king.
In fact, my mom was one of the people waiting on those long queues, and she still talks about it nearly 50 years later. And it was apparently a paradise for scalpers back when $20 was real money. Now, this new museum has been a long time in coming. Look here as the Smithsonian touts its opening in 2018, and this article was written in 2016. Man, think about all the stuff that's happened since then. Anyway, you get the point. Now that the museum is finally sort of open, it's the 5th largest museum in the world by exhibition space and the largest devoted solely to archaeology. Tourists are sure to come a-flocking, and so it seems that we can finally anticipate its full opening sometime later this year. So in the spirit of that hope, let's take a look at the museum's scintillating climax, the treasures of King Tut's tomb. First, let me give you a crash course in the historical background, but it really will be very brief because there are many, many, many documentaries on the subject. King Tut lived from 1341 to 1323 BC, so he died when he was just about 18 years old. And hence this facial reconstruction done using CT scans of his mummy depicts him as a young man. And this meant his reign began when he was a child, lasting just about 9 years. And thanks to ancient DNA testing, we can tell that he had malaria. Also, when his body was examined, he had quite a bad fracture of his kneecap, which very well may have become infected, and both of these probably contributed to his death. He also had a pretty pronounced scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, as well as perhaps a club foot. Now, not that much about his life is actually known because a lot of the records were destroyed or lost, but more about that later. His father was King Akhenaten, who we discussed previously in our episode about the Nefertiti bust. A wildly unpopular monarch because he turned the kingdom upside down by abandoning the old pantheon of gods and adopting a monotheistic system in which he was sort of the depiction of the one and only God on earth. Akhenaten was portrayed as a villain in later writings, and his system was abandoned, and hence not that much is known about his life. As for Tutankhamun's mother, it may or may not have been Nefertiti, but it certainly was a woman who was buried in tomb number 35 in the Valley of Kings, which belonged to Pharaoh Amenhotep II. Now here's where it gets weird. This woman, mother of Tutankhamun, was the daughter of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who was also the father of Akhenaten, making her Akhenaten's sister, meaning Tutankhamun was the son of her and her brother.
So if we have the same mother, tonight I'm gonna my brother.
So yeah, that may explain some of Tutankhamun's physical deformities. After all, incest has not proven to produce some of the most impressive or robust specimens. Anyway, the young King Tut seems to have reversed many of his father's unpopular religious and other policies, and this is evident in King Tut's very name. Tutankhamun sort of means something like the earthly embodiment of the god Amun, who was one of the ancient gods, sort of the king of the ancient god panoply, sort of like Zeus in ancient Greece. And King Tut changed this. His original name was Tutankhaten, which basically means the living embodiment of the god Aten. Now, Aten was the sun god his father adopted in that monotheistic religion. So King Tut and more likely his advisors, as they were trying to bring back the old ways, changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. However, although he did try to clean up his father's mess, Tutankhamun's short reign and association with the unpopular Akhenaten meant that his short reign didn't leave much of a mark on Egyptian history, and his premature death may have been unexpected as well. So for these reasons, he was buried in a small, unimpressive, and not even fully finished tomb, which is number 62 in the Valley of Kings, and he was largely forgotten about. In fact, 200 years or so after King Tut's death, the tomb of King Ramses V and then the sixth, KV9 in this photo, was then plopped right down on top of King Tut's.
How rude.
You see, because King Tut's reign was so forgettable, and his tomb completely obscured by the one on top of it, tomb raiders, not even Lara Croft, ever really looted it. Now, Carter's team did find some disturbances of items, looking like some were maybe moved or removed. But that would have had to have happened before the tomb of Ramses V was built, and these seemed to be abortive attempts at theft that were interrupted. So King Tut's tomb was like 99% intact. Anyway, despite the fact that King Tut was not a giant of Egyptian history, Carter had been searching in the Valley of Kings for about 5 years before the tomb was found, simply for the fact that Carter knew it was never discovered. And boy, was his patience and persistence rewarded. The absolute floor-to-ceiling treasures was like nothing ever seen. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but just think for a minute of those really amazing tombs of the really important Egyptian pharaohs, what they would have contained if they had not been looted, as nearly all of them were. So now we are going to take a deep look into some of the major pieces that Carter and team removed from that tomb. We can't possibly cover even a fraction of them, because Carter and team recovered exactly 5,398 artifacts, including that famous sarcophagus, furniture like the throne, chairs, and beds, tons of statues, a myriad of vessels, 2 chariots, etc. First, by far the most famous object is that funerary mask. Slightly larger than life-size because it was put on his face after all those wrappings had been applied. The mask is solid gold, weighing 10 kilos or 22 pounds, and it is inlaid with semi-precious stones and a kind of glass enamel. The eyes are obsidian inlaid in quartz, and the blue eyebrows and eyeliner is lapis lazuli. Little known is the fact that the reverse side of the mask is covered with a spell from the Book of the Dead meant to protect the king on his journey into the afterworld. And of course, the coffin itself is a marvel. In fact, there are 3 coffins weighing together a combined 1.3 metric tons. The outer 2 of these are made of gilded wood inlaid with glass and precious stones, but the innermost was pure gold and therefore outweighed the other 2. Wrapped along with the body were many treasures, but among these were two elaborately carved knives decorated with animal motifs and semi-precious stones. One of the blades was of gold and the other of iron. Now, these blades showed some signs of light use, so they must have had some sort of a function, but what that was remains unclear. The gold, of course, is the fanciest and therefore gets the most attention. But even if it was fortified with some kind of alloy, gold is very soft, so that's kind of an odd thing to make a blade out of. However, the more curious one was the iron blade, because Egyptians didn't have the knowledge or technology to smelt iron at this time. So Carter assumed the blades were imported from the Hittite or Mitanni in Anatolia, both of whom did possess this knowledge at the time. And see, that's the old problem we discussed with the three-age system in that particular video. You could have it being the Iron Age in one place and the Bronze Age in another. But here's the really crazy part. Much later in 2016, some XRF scanning was done on that iron knife. And based on the composition, it was determined that that was meteoric iron from a meteorite, meaning the metal for that blade literally came from out of this world. I discussed this briefly in my episode on alien archaeology, but then an even later analysis confirmed that yes, while it was meteoric iron, some of the adhesive on the blade contained lime, which would have come from the Hittites or the Mitanni. So, after all, it probably was a diplomatic gift from them to the young king. Next, of course, the king would have needed a throne, and boy, what a throne it was. Well, actually, there are two thrones. The first one, known as the bishop's seat, due to its resemblance of a medieval bishop's chair, is merely made of ebony wood inlaid with gold and ivory and semi-precious stones. However, the real showstopper is the so-called royal throne, which is covered in gold and depicts King Tut's queen, Akhenamun, rubbing ointment on the king's shoulder beneath the rays of the sun, representing the god Aten. So that must have been in the earlier part of his reign, before he reverted to the old religion and abandoned the religion of his father. And of course, a king needs to get around, doesn't he?
So you want to be a player, but your wheels ain't flying.
Well, that's what these two chariots were for. They were found partially dismantled in the tomb, but reassembled for the display in the museum. As with a lot of the other things, they're covered with semi-precious stones and inlaid with the usual motifs, but two particular ones stand out. First, there's one of the sun god, represented as the solar falcon. However, this refers to Horus, one of the old gods, not Aten, the one adopted by his father. So that indicates this chariot was probably made later in King Tut's reign, after he had abandoned his father's monotheistic system. And there's also an image of 6 foreign captives, indicating the king's prowess in war, which was pretty much job number 1 of any leader at this time. In other images, we've seen King Tut depicted on a chariot very much like this one, and that probably could give a hint as to what happened to him. Remember that broken kneecap? Definitely could have been the result of a chariot accident. And a king needs to amuse himself, right? So one way to do that is with a little bit of music. And hence there were 2 trumpets found in the tomb, one made of sterling silver and the other of copper. And after all these years, they could still play, which is exactly what musician James Tappern did on a 1939 BBC broadcast.
The trumpets of the pharaoh Tutankhamun.
Yikes, okay, maybe not so much of the music. Well, how about some board games? That's definitely something you can do when you have all eternity ahead of you and you're feeling, well, bored. So we have a total of 4 board games in the tomb, at least one each of a game called Senate and another of the so-called Game of 20. Now, nobody knows the rules for sure, but there are some clues. You have a piece that you move through the board, and there's also this symbol for water, which ancient Egyptians and other people believed was a barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead that the deceased had to pass through. So putting these clues together, it's believed this is some kind of a game also to communicate with the dead. Think like a checkerboard and a Ouija board got together and had a baby. And finally, a king's gotta look good, right? So there was a bust of the king that served as a mannequin. They're pretty sure of this fact given that the body was unadorned, and the king is depicted without the usual royal beard or other regalia that was required for the public images of royalty. Remember from the episode about the Nefertiti bust, royal images were strictly regulated, and there could be big trouble for an artist who deviated from the norm. Now, this mannequin was very sensible considering the tomb was full of the king's clothes and jewelry. 12 fancy robes, socks and underwear, the king's baby clothes, and literally dozens of pairs of sandals, including this golden one. That's enough to give Imelda Marcos a run for her money. These were found on his feet, but given how fragile they were and the total lack of wear, these were probably not worn in his life. They were made specifically for his death. Anyway, to be honest, as much as I've talked, this is just scratching the surface. You get a sense of how incredible this collection is. It's the mother of archaeology porn. Kind of one porn to rule them all. And given the opening of this amazing new museum, you're going to see the collection in better circumstances than anyone else ever has. First of all, you won't have to deal with the cluttered old Egyptian museum in Tahrir Square, downtown Cairo. While that place is an amazing historical site in and of itself, sort of a museum to museums, it's also cluttered, crowded, and in a general state of disrepair. You'll also benefit from not having to deal with the curse of the mummy. And you heard me right, the curse of the mummy. Now, the origin of this so-called curse is that a suspicious number of people who entered King Tut's tomb around the time of Carter suffered from mysterious respiratory ailments and died shortly thereafter or prematurely. There was Lord Carnarvon and George J. Gould, son of the American financier, both of whom died the year after the tomb was opened. And there was Arthur Mace, who became sickly thereafter and died 5 or 6 years later. Obviously, these were just the big guys. The fate of all of those local workers is really unknown, but I guess who cares about them anyway? But speculation has survived over the years because the excavation notes note the presence of black fungus in the tomb. And subsequently, mummies excavated in more modern circumstances have been found to be infested with the toxic Aspergillus flavus fungus. In fact, it's believed that some Polish archaeologists died prematurely for this very reason after opening the 500-year-old tomb of King Kashmir IV in 1973. Anyway, the truth behind this is impossible to know, but the important point is it's not something you're going to have to deal with. Finally, if you want to see the tomb itself, that's definitely worth a visit in the Valley of Kings, but that will require a flight or a felucca ride down the Nile to Luxor. However, recall, the tomb was small and unimpressive to begin with, and it was unfinished, so it will actually pale in comparison to some of the others you can see there. And to be honest, based on my guide's advice, I actually gave it a skip. Because with your entry into the valley, you only get 3 tombs to visit, 3 choices. And remember, there are others that are a lot more amazing. So given that constraint and the time we had, I actually did not go into King Tut's tomb. And nowadays, it's extra to see King Tut's tomb anyway, so it's up to you if you want to shell out the extra dough. But if you ask me, the main event is really back up in Cairo at the Grand Egyptian Museum. That grave goods assemblage is the hottest ticket in town. And though there won't be any deadly spores, you may find yourself a little feverish because it is hot. And once you see it, you will never forget it. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.